In this episode, I am once again joined by Mary Shutan, author, occultist, and spiritual teacher. Mary discusses her new book, Shadow Work for the Soul, shares her lifelong fascination with the psychological power of dark fairy tales, and explains the function of social masks and personae. Mary remarks on a notable increase in spiritual emergencies, a rise in nihilism and the dark feminine, and offers advice for those facing spiritual crisis. Mary then takes a deep dive into shadow work, challenges common misconceptions, and offers surprising reflections on both masculine-feminine New Age trends and the work of Byron Katie. Mary also reveals how to perceive the shadow in popular culture, warns about the danger of spiritual bypass, and explains how to identify and disarm the ego defenses to go beyond one's limitations. So without further ado, Mary Shutan. Mary Shutan, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm so delighted to be talking with you again. And today we're going to focus on your new book, Shadow Work for the Soul, published by Findhorn Press. Very interesting book indeed. We're going to delve into that. But before we do, we were just talking before we began recording, I was reflecting with you on our last episode, which was some 2 years ago at the time of this recording. And in that episode, we talked a lot about your biography and also your work with people who are going through Kundalini crisis and spiritual emergency of various types. You do group work and individual work with people facing those kinds of situations. And I'd asked you, how's that going? Have you noticed anything interesting? And you said that you have noticed an uptick in spiritual emergency that involves some kind of crisis. So I'm wondering if you might say a little bit more about that. What is behind this uptick, do you think, in spiritual crisis, spiritual emergency?
Yeah, it's something that I've been pondering for the past 5 years or so. For me, discernment is a large part of my practice. So at first the question was, do more people know about my work and are simply contacting me, or is this reflective of something that's going on communally? And the answer that I've gotten over the past 5 years is that yes, more people seem to be going through spiritual crises of some sort. Spiritual emergency, it has, kind of different names for it. And I think that a lot of it is reflective, we can blame the pandemic, but we are living in an increasingly isolative society, where we're becoming more and more disconnected from spirituality as a whole. And so when people have these experiences, they may not have anybody to reach out to. It may not be something that they see readily reflected back to them. Um, and they may be in a place where they no longer have a source of positive community anymore. In terms of spiritual emergency, a lot of times what comes up is a lot of stuff that requires healing, basically. And some of our healing, it is easy to reach out for resources regarding, and in some cases, it can be a little bit more difficult.
What kinds of things experiences are people reporting to you as their spiritual emergencies? Are there particular trends or that you're noticing?
Yeah, I'm noticing a lot of what might be called mental health crisis. So a lot of people that are going into things that we might term dark night of the soul, where they feel incredibly hopeless, a lot of kind of nihilism, nothing has any point to it. Everything is meaningless. Um, a lot of just very depressive, sort of angsty sort of stuff. I would say previous to the past 5 years, I was getting people that were in varying types of spiritual emergency, but what tended to happen with that group was that they had gone to a workshop, meditation retreat, something like that, And what was happening is that they were having a bunch of trauma coming up that needed to be sorted through and needed to be integrated and processed and, all that sort of stuff. Um, and over the past 5 years, I've noticed a trend where people are going into these dark nights and really kind of remaining there where they feel hopeless about what's going on with themselves, hopeless about what's going on with the world. And it seems a place a lot of people are getting quite stuck.
You mentioned in Shadow Work for the Soul about collective shadow, and one of the dynamics you work with there is our reactions to news figures, celebrity figures, and so on. Is there some sort of a change in the news landscape that is driving some of this anxiety? Or do you think really the world itself is becoming a more worrisome place?
I think it's a bit of both. I think that if anybody has a bit of awareness, what is going on in the world is concerning, to say the least. One of the things that's really important to understand about collective shadows and just collective energies as a whole is that they're kind of like a wave that comes up. And part of that is that people tend to drown in those waves. But if we look at it from kind of a glass half full perspective, these energies are really coming up for us to heal, to become aware of, to get to know. And so we've been definitely going through this period of darkness. I would even call it kind of a period of like the dark feminine rising. In which we have all of these energies of rage, of fear, of just darkness overall, of violence, anger, all of that sort of stuff rising, hatred, separation, all of that. And if we are able, willing to look into that abyss, so to speak, we can do a lot of personal and collective healing. But yes, those energies are very much front and center for a lot of folks right now.
Well, I'd like to return to that theme of collective shadows a little later. What are you advising people then who are coming to you with this, and then we can turn to talk about the book itself?
For people who are experiencing kind of that sort of hopelessness, nihilism, one of the things that can be helpful is to understand that we should have reaction to the world. If there are terrible things going on in the world, we shouldn't deny that. That is something that we can, rightfully fully say, like, hey, I should be having a reaction to this. In terms of world energies, one of the things that people can do is start to separate out what is personal reaction versus what is sort of rightful reaction to what is going on in the world. There's a reason why, we may react to one event or be fixated on one event rather than another. In terms of the sort of spiritual emergency stuff that we were talking about, um, it is again helpful to sort of name things. If people are going through a dark night of the soul, something like that, it is helpful to understand that they are going through that, because part of what happens when we're in a space like that is that we feel like we're the only one, and understanding that it has a name, and we are by far not the first person to experience this. That gives people the ability to really understand, like, okay, this is what I'm experiencing. And that gives them a sort of roadmap out of there. And that roadmap out of there is to really feel into that depression, that despair, and ultimately that disconnection from spiritual reality, which is ultimately at the root of a lot of this. And find the appropriate resources to acknowledge that and feel that, and to start in their own way to become a bit more connected again.
Very interesting. Thank you. So let's turn, shall we, to Shadow Work for the Soul. I'm curious, what is the story behind this book? In our last episode, when we traced your biography, it seemed to be the case that a lot of your books come from particular periods of your life or phases of your life or areas in which you're focused, and there's often a personal link there. I'm curious if that's the case for this book, or if not, then what was it that inspired this book in particular?
Ever since I was a kid, I was really interested in myth and fairy tale and folk tale. And I think a lot of kids are, but that that interest never left for me. My mother was a teacher of Shakespeare, and so there were a lot of kind of those elements of myth in my household. When I got into my early 20s, I really started looking at and understanding the psychology behind myth. I started basically I found the works of Marion Woodman and Marie-Louise von France, these exceptional authors that really described to me on a deeper level why I was so interested in fairy tales and myths and um, you know, their descriptions, their ways of sort of anchoring me into that work has made up a big part of my understanding of self, understanding of reality. And so ultimately it's been, something that I've shared with others.
And what sort of insights did you gain then into why it was you were so fascinated with myth? And you also said insights into yourself from Marie von France and people like that.
Yeah. There are a couple of things that stand out. First is that, I was always kind of a dark child. And so, not necessarily like in a gloomy way, but just interested in the darker facets of reality. And so if you look at fairy tales and folk tales, they don't shy away from that stuff. They go straight into it, even for children. If you look at the biggest character in fairy tales, it's always death. And death isn't, promoted as this like scary figure. It's just this neutral figure that's, kind of a part of life. Um, Another facet that those fairy tales and folk tales really showed was the concept of archetypes and how fairy tales and these sort of mythic figures really showed us our most basic human stories, our most basic human interests. I've been interested in writing for a long time. And so in writing courses, you talk about, the very human stories that make up, human impulse, human creation, that sort of stuff. And what myths really show us are these figures that um, show us kind of like the baseline patterns of our being. And to me, that was just incredibly revelatory about like, why I identified with Sisyphus so much, why I felt so, such an instinctual pull towards like the princess and the pea, stuff like that.
Why did you?
Well, in The Princess and the Pea, we're talking about someone who, despite I forget how many mattresses, could still feel the pea under there. And for a large portion of my life, I was the princess and the pea. And so seeing that, I was just like, oh, I see myself in the princess and the pea and her difficulties with existence. When we're talking about Sisyphus, it is such an interesting character. For anyone that's kind of a big nerd like I am, I really suggest Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, because Sisyphus really shows one of our deepest shadows, which is suicidal ideation, the feeling that no matter what we do, it doesn't matter. Sisyphus was punished by needing to roll that boulder up the hill. And when he got it up the hill, it would just come back down the hill again. And so he was caught in this loop, this never-ending pattern of punishment where he needed to keep on doing that. And to so many of us, we've gone through periods of our lives where we really feel that sense of hopelessness, that sense that the universe in some way is or the gods or in some way is punishing us. And so if we're able to see ourselves in these myths, in these fairy tales, what we can understand is like really the basics of the human condition. And by really understanding them and digging into them, we can know that, first of all, it's not just us, but we can also have a path towards healing them, a path towards really understanding and accepting that part of our nature.
And is that healing brought about by the relating to the character and the seeing of oneself, or seeing an expression of what one's feeling inside on the outside? Is that the mechanism of healing, or is there more to it than that? For example, the Princess and the Pea, or Sisyphus in your case.
Yeah, I would say that that is a big part of it. We really require seeing ourselves reflected in outer reality in order to find a measure of acceptance. For example, even in celebrity culture, if a celebrity, there is, it may seem more superficial because we're talking about Sisyphus right now, but on the latest season of Top Chef, there is a man who is, he's a chef and he also has physical limitations and he's using a cane. Seeing this to one of my friends, he was like, oh yeah, maybe I can continue in my physical labor job because here is this person who is already doing that. Um, and this happens all the time if we're talking about, reflections into celebrity and pop culture and advertisements. If we see ourselves represented, that is very healing for us. So that does make up a big percentage of the healing. What happens when we experience trauma of some variety is that we feel like we are the only one. It is a very isolative sort of process. And so a big part of healing then is understanding that we are not the only person to suffer with what we are suffering. And beyond that, reaching out for support in some variety to be able to express whatever we need to express through ourselves, even if we're talking about things like, the myth of Sisyphus and, suicidal ideation, or the princess and the pea. One of our basic psychological primary needs is to be heard and seen. And the ability to be heard and seen is deeply healing.
Okay, interesting. So you've mentioned the word rebel there a number of times, and you write in the book, the purpose of shadow work is not to become beings of light, but to revel in the dark. We can become a fully human being, accepting and allowing every aspect of ourselves to become a part of us again. So I'm curious, what is the shadow, as you've used that word in this book, and what is therefore shadow work?
The shadow is the parts of ourselves that we're not aware of. In some cases, it's the parts of ourselves that we've repressed or denied. Jung defined it as the entirety of the subconscious. So what happens throughout the course of our lives is that we learn that parts of ourselves are not societally acceptable. They're not acceptable by our parents, they're not acceptable by our schools. And what happens is that we start cutting off aspects of ourselves. And out of that, the shadow is sort of born. And another aspect of our shadow is just simply the parts of ourselves that we're not in contact with. And so, for example, if we are an extrovert, and we have been given that identity and that is part of our natural nature, we may not have explored the parts of ourselves that are shy or quiet or, want to spend time at the library or something like that. And so that is a part of the shadow as well. Shadow work is a process of looking at all of those parts of ourselves that we have denied or repressed, and bringing them back online, making them a part of us, a part of our whole again. So instead of them being cut off or us not being aware of them, they become a part of us, a part of our totality.
Sometimes one hears the shadow talked about as something you don't like about yourself, a tendency that one can, in fact, clearly see and may be all too painfully aware of, but one doesn't like. And you're, I see, going with the more accurate, I think, Jungian definition of the shadow being something that you're unaware of, or at least that's where it starts, in this sort of unaware place. I wonder if you might comment on this popular idea one sometimes hears as the shadow side being a part of yourself that you are aware of, you can clearly see, but you don't like.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot because it happens, I have a background, for example, as an acupuncturist and body worker and, like all of these sorts of things. And what happens in all of these fields is that um, when they meet pop culture, they change and shift. And the reason that they change and shift is to meet communal energies at the time. There's, no question about, we are in a time of the shadow. Okay, shadow work is popular. Um, that's not a coincidence, sort of thing. But if we were to look deeper at things, what really happens, and you can see this quite clearly with things like acupuncture, is that acupuncture was really a non-linear sort of poetic philosophy, based off of, Taoism, based off of palpating acupuncture points. And what happened when actually Nixon opened relations with China is that this flux of Asian modalities, Asian sort of, practices started coming into the US because there was a desire for them, there was interest in them. There were already some acupuncturists in California and that sort of stuff due to immigration, but what happened then is that in order to get acupuncture education to a place where it would be at least partially accepted by places like hospitals and stuff like that, was that it started to, you know, go from a mind body spirit modality to a mind body modality to more of a mind modality. And so people now, there's some acupuncturists who just believe acupuncture is about stimulating neuromuscular junctions and stuff like that. They don't believe in energy and chi. And so that was kind of a long spiel, but that kind of shows a lot of what happens when things become popularized, is that they need to make parts of themselves shadow, basically, to meet larger groups of people where they are. And there is something that definitely is lost in the process. But as a counterpoint, we now have people doing shadow work, and maybe they're doing it as an odd way to deny the self. We can always use spiritual work to sort of spiritually bypass stuff. But what I like to think is happening is that they're being met in a way where they are ready and willing to engage. They're ready and willing to dip their toes into the emotional waters, so to speak.
But one of the drawbacks, perhaps, of thinking of shadow work as working on the things you don't like about yourself that you already know you don't like, is that it misses that hidden aspect, that sense that possibly, which seems so crucial to the original conceptions of shadow work, that there's things we don't see, actually, about ourselves, or things that we think are outside, that we see outside and around us, but are actually really projections from the inside. You have that quote from Jung in one of your chapters that the quote, I'm sure, about fate. Do you recall the one I'm thinking of?
I'm always going to screw it up, but basically the things that we deny in ourselves, we call we call fate. um I'm sure I mangled that quote as I do some other
Uh,
quotes.
I
But
couldn't quite remember it either, which is why I asked you to do
yeah,
it.
if you're put on the spot, you always forget your favorite quotes. But yes, it's in the book. But basically, the concept is like, yeah, we. Um, I would agree that the pop culture sort of conceptualizations of shadow work, they're sort of, it's like a drop in the great ocean of what shadow work can offer. I have worked very hard over the years to be compassionate towards those sort of pop culture conceptualizations because, that's actually part of shadow work is, looking at those people, looking at people that you see as other, looking at people that you dislike. Ultimately, the end result of shadow work is this experience of oneness. And we talk about oneness as being this like awe-inspiring sort of cosmic experience. And it certainly does have that facet, but the really sort of more grounded experience of oneness is the ability to look at another human being and see a part of yourself reflected. And when you're able to do that, you start meeting people with compassion and interest instead of hatred. Or in the book, I talk about, superiority, inferiority loop, dismission, being condescending, all of that sort of stuff, hatred. Because if you look at shadow work, when we hate another, it is really reflective of our own ignorance, our own self-hatred. So that is a huge part of the book, a huge part of shadow work that, yes, um, uh, more popular conceptualizations of shadow work are certainly missing this idea of that what happens when we deny an aspect of ourselves, we tend to push it out and project it onto other people.
When you're talking there about hatred for the other being perhaps an aspect of our own ignorance, I think somebody who, so this is a common, I think, shadow work idea that those who evoke strong emotion, positive or negative, strong reactions in us, sometimes there's something there that may be a bit of a clue, bit of an X on the map for the shadow work, a place to start digging. Somebody who made something of a, I was thinking blood sport, but that's quite not right. Maybe a stage act of that is Byron Katie, with her questions where she would take emotional issues and then flip the roles. A sort of shadow work jujitsu of types, and people would cry and stuff, and they get a lot of views on YouTube. So I'm curious. Do you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Byron Katie?
I do, yes. I am familiar with the work and all that, yeah.
What do you
Um,
think? What do you think? Aside from the hubris of calling anything the work, what do you think of Byron Katie's approach?
I think that it is quite easy to take this work and sort of distill it to a place where it lacks nuance. If you are going to a place where, and this happens not only with Byron Katie, but a lot of, if you study cults and cult leaders and stuff like that, what happens is that ultimately you are the creator and of your own circumstances. And so what happens with that is a lot of victim blaming, is that everything is your fault. And for example, let's talk about nuance. I was in the car the other day, heavy traffic. Somebody in front of me was driving like a complete idiot. They slammed on their brakes. Maybe they were nervous or whatever. Who knows what their story is, um, that I could probably have compassion for. But in the moment, they created fear in me. They created anger in me because, hot day, they were driving, maybe shouldn't have had a license, all of that sort of stuff. And none of that had anything to do with me. My reaction was completely appropriate considering the circumstances. We should have feelings. We should have reactions. All of our feelings are messengers. They are giving us information regarding a specific situation. For example, I always teach my students the message of anger. Irritation means a mild boundary violation. Anger means a moderate boundary violation. Rage is a severe boundary violation. In those situations, it is then up to the person to consider, do I consider every minor irritation, with rage, maybe there's something for me to work on. But what I notice about Byron Katie and about a lot of others is that they desire to take the emotions out of things, acting like if we reach some place of enlightenment, we're not meant to have emotions, or we're only meant to be in bliss all of the time. They sort of take out the human aspects of things, and what ends up happening is that everything becomes the person's fault. And if you really study what happens in cults with stuff like this, if everything is the person's fault, well, then nothing is the guru or leader's fault. And what that means is that the guru or leader can act like a complete tool or do whatever they're doing and blame the student, blame the follower for whatever is going on. So if I were to simplify, I would say that people really latch on to these sort of simple methods of things, and I do find that there is a bit of utility in them, but when you are so limited in them, what happens is that they result in a lot of backlash and a lot of people who are anti-emotion, anti-sort of humaning.
Very interesting. Thank you. And you write in the book about the ego, and you contrast that with the self, and you talk about the ego, its role, and its defense mechanism. So I wonder, as it pertains to shadow work, if you might say something about that.
Yeah, in terms of shadow work, the ego, we are intended to have a healthy ego. The ego in terms of shadow work is considered our conceptualization of self. And with that conceptualization of self, what happens is that our ego has a lot of defenses. And what those defenses essentially do is keep us in the known, keep us who we are, keep the other out, what is unknown out regarding ourselves. And so if we do have a healthy, flexible ego, what happens is that we can interface with new information, consider if it works for us, consider if we want to change our belief systems or ways of going about things based off of that information. And then our ego and our conceptualization of self, our identity changes to meet that consideration. When we start talking about an ego that is more and more defended, what happens is that information that is already not known is perceived as more and more threatening. And so this can mean anything from just simply denying that information to attacking the messenger for that information, to living, as we see some people do these days, just in a complete environment of fear where any conceptualization of the other is something that is going to imminently attack or, be some huge, huge threat to the person.
And what are some examples of these defense mechanisms, and how does one recognize if one is in the grip of something like that?
There are some more kind of like simple ones. One of them that I started to notice was that when I was reading books, my mind would sort of blank or sort of gloss over some information. And when our minds do that, we may just not find it interesting, but what happens sometimes when we interface with information is that our minds will sort of blank a bit, so we don't have to interface with it. So it's, currently out of our comfort zone. So if we notice ourselves doing that, we can kind of bring ourselves back, or at least mark the chapter or the paragraph to look at later. Another thing that I really talk about with a lot of people is, intellectualization is a big ego defense. We tend to keep things in our minds rather than feel them in our bodies. And so a lot of my work, I talk about embodiment with people, with truly feeling things, with truly experiencing them. We need intellectualization in order to, at first, kind of interface with a topic. We often need to mentally understand things before we can live them out. But so many of us prevent ourselves from living things out, especially if we're talking about spirituality and spiritual concepts, and we never truly live them. And so it's difficult, but noticing things like our own hypocrisy is, a big deal. Noticing things where we say things where we have these judgments and morals for others, but not for ourselves, for example. Another thing that I really talk about in the book, which is really the ultimate egoic defense, is the superiority-inferiority loop. What happens when we feel inferior, when we have self-worth issues within, is that our ego defends ourselves by the superiority-inferiority loop. And what that means is that we will feel a need to be superior to everyone that is around us. And in that, we will express our contempt for them. We'll call them sheep. We'll think of them as lesser or idiots or, whatever words we may have for them. Or we may flip to the other side of things where we feel inferior and we look at, people on Instagram's vacations or, perfect families or, stuff like that, or celebrities and what they have and their talents, and feel worthless as a result of that. And both of those are aspects that we really could look at and work on and notice in terms of the shadow. So there's a lot. I kind of tell people, it's a little bit facetious, but it really is true. Like that if anybody spent a year who's really interested in becoming a conscious individual, if anybody spent a year just focusing on the superiority-inferiority loop and breaking that down, they would become a much more conscious being than they are right now.
You do offer various techniques in the book for addressing some of these shadows once they've been identified. For example, the superiority-inferiority loop. One of those techniques is the world as a mirror. And this is a way of working with projection, simple, direct, and indirect projection. I wonder if you might say something about this idea of world as mirror. It's the title of one of the chapters. And perhaps any other techniques that come to mind. You've listed, of course, many in the book, as to how to work with shadow.
One of the things that happened through my own spiritual awakening, and it's also revealed in a lot of texts, tantric texts, Kashmir Shaivism, like a lot of conceptualizations of reality, is that you discover that you are the person next to you. We contain, all the people, the world in us, the universe in us, and reality is a mirror. What it shows us is a reflection of our ideologies, a reflection of our shadows. And in this, I talk about how shadow work is one of the most direct paths to becoming conscious, because the things that we're conscious of in regards to healing, they are important. But sometimes I relate this, I use a lot of water and imagery in my work. Sometimes I relate this as like the shadows are kind of like, Cthulhu, or like the big, huge octopus at the bottom of the ocean that we sort of push aside. We tend to work on like the little fish and the krill and stuff like that. Those are important, but we tend to miss the big stuff because it's threatening to our ego to work on those things. If we were to work on those things, our conceptualization of self would need to change. And even though we might want that, it's still threatening to us. So in terms of reality as the mirror, in shadow work, we can look at that on different levels. The first level that I suggest to people is to look at what they claim in other people as being about a neglected aspect or denied aspect of themselves. if you think that one person is a jerk, like, okay, but if you think that, 10 people are jerks, maybe that's something to look at in yourself. If we keep on meeting the same type of people, getting in the same type of relationships, that's really something to look at within ourselves and to consider what needs to be healed there. What am I blocking out regarding myself? The same can be thought of in regards to our thoughts regarding the world, regarding pop culture, regarding politics. Again, this requires nuance because if we look at the world, obviously politics and war and all this sort of stuff is horrible and awful and, scary in its own right. But our way of looking at the world, our way of looking at reality very much shows who we are and what we could stand to work at within ourselves. I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to be like, in that sort of toxic positivity mode where they think that everything is wonderful. But a lot of people are in a place where they find the universe, the world, their community threatening, that the universe is against them, that they're kind of locked in that victim mentality. And people in that mentality need to consider, and I know it's a difficult thing to do, but need to consider what of this is right, what of this is correct, and what of this could be my mentality, that what I'm seeing in reality is really a reflection of what is unhealed within me.
Something else you discuss in the book is this idea of spiritual bypass. And you write, it's quite easy to utilize spiritual concepts to look away from the body and the world. And you cite John Wellwood as the man who first introduced this idea of this phrase of spiritual bypass. I wonder if you might say something about that. It seems like, at first glance, spiritual practices of various types seems like they'd be well suited to investigating oneself and illuminating the shadow aspects and so on, and becoming whatever more spiritual and so on. But there's also, it seems, a trap there, possibly, in these sorts of spiritual views and spiritual ideas.
It is quite easy to utilize spirituality to provide comfort rather than reality, and to escape the body and the life rather to ground more deeply into it. So I do understand the comfort, a lot of our spirituality is, really offered to us in order to sort of comfort a troubled soul. Okay, if you only think right, you will be healthy, you will be rich, sort of things. And we believe these things not because they are true, we believe them because they're comforting. I'm sure a lot of us have been at a point in our lives where we just wanted to be told that everything will be okay, even though that person who's saying it to us may have, absolutely no idea if things that'll be okay. But when we are in a place of suffering, receiving comfort like that, even if it has no basis in spiritual truth, is something that it is quite easy for a lot of us to cling to. It is quite easy for us, to sort of, especially in the modern world, kind of cobble a spirituality regarding. In terms of escapism, it is quite easy, especially kind of in the age of the internet, but just in general, to use spirituality to create this persona. We may be struggling and stressed and feel poorly about ourselves, in our daily lives. And a lot of us turn to spirituality because we do experience some level of wounding, some level of suffering that we're looking to alleviate. And what happens is that we again turn to spiritualities that are more about escaping the body, escaping the life, for specific examples. And again, I feel compassion for this group, but it is a trend, again, that I've probably noticed over the last 5-10 years is people claiming enlightenment. They are so above everything, nothing matters. They're superior to all, everybody else is, sheep or lesser than them. They're ascending to the fifth dimension. And if you really start to work it with them and really start to engage with them beyond sort of the intellectualization, the sort of like word salad stuff that can get kind of popular when we're just in our minds, their lives are a mess because whenever we wear a mask of spirituality and we're not living it out, our wounds are going to kind of come front and center. And so the simple answer is that a lot of people use spirituality to sort of escape their bodies and their lives and being human rather than sort of grounding more deeply in them.
You described a mask there of the fifth dimensional ascendee, whose otherwise life is a bit of a train wreck. I wonder what other kinds of masks, maybe you think about, also you mentioned Shakespeare before, different characters and so on. What other kinds of characters are there of spiritual bypass? The fifth dimensional ascendee, maybe a bit of light language thrown in for that one. What other kind of masks might we become somewhat, in a sense, taken by?
Yeah, I think that discussing masks and personas is really fascinating in the age of the internet because we have people who construct their entire identity as being the perfect housewife on YouTube, the perfect, uh, anorexic, supermodel on Instagram, the perfect TikTok dancer or whatever the thought is, And so we're very much living in an age where people's personas online and who they truly are incredibly different. And so it is easy for any of us to look online and to feel those sort of if we're not aware of this, these sort of shadows of jealousy or these sort of shadows of like, oh, they're so perfect and I am not sort of thing. But we really can look at the age of the explosion of social media as really being the age of explosion of, this false sense of perfection and all of these masks that people are wearing.
As you talk about persona there, and the sorts of labels and roles that people gravitate towards and then represent, I wonder if it's possible for self-development work or self-inquiry work, etc., to become mixed up with that somehow, or to become conflated with that.
I think that it is, I find self-inquiry to be extraordinary. I think that it is incredibly important for people to have a touchstone, somebody to talk to, somebody to chat with. And I'm not saying that just because, I'm a spiritual teacher. I'm just saying that like in general, find somebody that, has a good head on their shoulders. I don't care if they do woodworking or, something like that. But who you can touch base with because it is easy to use even the most wonderful modalities, wonderful like self-inquiry to sort of veer down a left-hand path that we may not want to go down, to use it in a way that isn't helpful anymore. One of the ways is like how you were describing what happens, and we can talk about this as like a mask or persona, but one of the things that happens with spirituality is that there again needs to be a bit of nuance, initially people finding labels that describe who they are I've had, for example, several clients who, as adults, have been, gone through testing or defined themselves as autistic. And for them, it has been incredibly affirming because it explains a lifetime of thinking a bit differently, or interacting with people in a different way. And the same thing can be thought of as as sexuality as well. People discovering that they're demisexual, or they're trans, or whatever they're discovering. That label initially can be a giant reclaiming for people, and it is really helpful. There is a point past that where there needs to be considered, am I hanging on to this label? Am I hanging on to whatever my belief system is, whatever my lifestyle, diet, spiritual, whatever I'm doing, to the extent that I'm either engaging in the superiority inferiority loop, or I'm so letting it eclipse my personality and identity that letting go of it would be the next really kind of huge step in becoming more conscious for us.
Yes, indeed. And speaking as we were of spiritual bypassing, I wonder if you agree that sometimes one's spiritual experiences or spiritual attainments, such as they are, might also fit that same sort of dynamic.
Yeah, they do. Uh, One of the big, I would say, initiations, or, sort of shocks of my existence. We definitely go through a lot of initiations on the spiritual path. At the beginning, it's usually about personal healing. After that, it tends to be about belief, confronting beliefs and kind of ways of being and aspects of identity. Um, and one of the biggest initiations for me was when I got to a point where I saw that sort of my quest for enlightenment, sort of thing, really came from a place of narcissism and selfishness. If you really look at it, and I know that this is going to be like, probably get some grouchy emails about this, but it's a hard truth to look at, because what that initiation does is that it has you confront not only your own selfishness, but the kind of tendency in our human nature to be selfish and our reaction to that. And if we're able to move past that initiation, what happens is that you recognize that you don't need to be extraordinary anymore. You don't need to be enlightened anymore. You can just be an ordinary human being. And to let that go, both sort of that idea of the quest and also that sort of identity and conceptualization of self, is tricky for a lot of people, and a lot of people do not make it past that that initiation. So there are a lot of them that I can talk about, but that's the one that kind of comes up for me, because so many people are looking based off of basic wounding to be special, to be chosen, to kind of live out, again, another archetype, sort of the Harry Potter chosen one archetype, and to let that go and be an ordinary, everyday human being. It is a lot for the mind to release, and but it is such a wonderful release to recognize that you don't need to be perfect, recognize that you don't need to ascend, you don't need to do anything, then be who you are.
You don't even need to be enlightened.
Exactly. Yeah. In the book, I do have like a thought that, there is no enlightenment. There are just those who have given up the path. So that is, my and that, the spiritual path is full of paradoxes. And like, once I gave up that conceptualization, my life has gotten so much better, because I don't need to be enlightened. I don't need to be perfect. I don't need to do this thing or that. I can just, um, uh, be who I am, and that is good enough. That is perfect enough.
At what point in your life did you go through that initiation of giving up that whole framework?
Like 2020, 2021. The difficulty when you're talking about initiations like this is that when you look back at them, you know, when I was talking about, for example, in the last interview about having a Kundalini awakening, I could say, okay, my Kundalini awakening started in 2003, but that was really when the first like symptoms that I couldn't ignore happened. Now I can recognize, you know, stuff in childhood and being like, oh yeah, there was spiritual stuff going on then, you know, sort of thing. And the same thing sort of happens with initiations, is that there is a point at which a sort of door opens, but there's kind of a contemplation phase, an action phase, and then when actually most of your consciousness, most of your self sort of goes through, and then there's sort of an integration phase. So, and that can take years or decades or something like that. So, I guess I would say my current conceptualization is that I'm through the door, but still sort of integrating and collecting all the aspects of self from that doorway, if that in any way makes sense.
Yes, it does. I'm wondering what were some of the surprising implications or consequences of that initiation as it really started to gather steam.
One of the difficulties of my life has been that I always have been a pretty high achieving individual. At one point, it was something like a lot of people that was what Carl Rogers called conditions of worth, was something that was like, here, I'm worthwhile, I'm valuable, I published a book, I have a degree, you know, look at me, I have all the certifications, sort of thing. So what has been difficult for me on a lot of levels is spiritually what happens is that you can evolve to a point where, for example, letting go of being an acupuncturist was a difficulty for me, letting go of that identity, letting go of my practice, because it wasn't who I was anymore. Obviously, I carry that knowledge and understanding with me, but I came to a point where letting go was necessary. And what happens if you don't let go is that you become miserable. You notice that something isn't right in your life. And so I've gone through periods of that. I will say that the book we're talking about now, Shadow Work for the Soul, it is one that has been in conception for a long period of time. And for the foreseeable future, it is likely my last nonfiction book. And so letting go of my identity as a nonfiction writer, letting go of my identity lately as I've been doing shamanic and spiritual work for 20 years, letting go of that to some degree, because that path really overshadows your whole life, so to speak. Letting go of these things when it has been time to let go of them is always a tricky thing, because in a lot of cases there's been so much energy, so much effort, so much sacrifice, so much life force that has gone into them.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you. You talk in the book about the power of being ordinary. It seems that you're talking to that here. One more aspect, and then perhaps I'd like to finish talking about collective shadows. One more aspect that I'm curious about is you write about the animus and the anima. And you write here, we each contain both masculine and feminine polarities within ourselves. Instead of considering these to be strictly male or female, we can view them as archetypal understandings of the self on a masculine to feminine continuum. So I'm wondering about this animus and anima. Of course, it's a classic Jungian concept. How does that idea show up in today's landscape around, I suppose, today's cultural landscape around things like gender and sexuality? You already referred to that.
Yeah, that was part of what I was getting to into that quote, is that in terms of like basic energetic polarities, the feminine polarity is considered to be the body, and is specifically the genitals, the first chakra. And the masculine polarity is considered to be the head, or the crown chakra. we have very much lived in a society and spiritual landscape in which we prize the head and the crown chakra, but we neglect the body and the feminine polarity. One of the things that it took me a long time to understand, I was an occultist for a long period of time, and in occult, there are all sorts of rituals which call for feminine and masculine forces. And one of the things that I learned over time was that if you're having a meeting of all the directions, for example, like water and earth are considered part of the feminine and fire and air are considered the masculine, is that if you have the person's spirit who best embodies that that element or that polarity, that the magic works much better rather than if you're just like, okay, you're male, so you're going to be fire, or you're male, so you're going to be, in the male part of things. So what I would say, we have such a focus on this binary, and a lot of it is breaking down in our culture right now of masculine versus feminine. This is a man, this is a woman sort of thing. And really, if you look at, you can get to a point of understanding that coming into contact with all aspects of ourselves and just looking at it as a continuum, masculine, feminine, and in the center is ambiguous or androgynous aspects of ourselves. What happens if we embrace that whole continuum within ourselves is that if we are really, confident in being a man, it doesn't matter if we're wearing like a 1980s prom dress, or something like that. If we were really comfortable in our femininity, we can wear like, of course, I'm being really superficial with this. Like we can, wear a suit or, whatever like that. And so what actually happens when we embrace this whole continuum within ourselves is that we embrace the entirety of our bodies. We do what Marion Woodman calls putting the head on the body, where we, embrace all aspects of ourselves from dark to light. And then from that, we can choose to decide which part of the continuum that we are most comfortable with, and we can play around with other aspects of the continuum if we care to.
Let's return then to where we began as we wrap up this very interesting conversation about your latest book, Shadow Work for the Soul, to talk again about collective shadows. And you write here, we can gauge what is arising in the collective unconscious by viewing the news cycles and listening to what we talk about with others. Just as we experience topics that emerge from our depths into our individual consciousness, the world also experiences the deepest shadows of its ocean floor rising to the surface. I find that very interesting indeed, this idea that one can, in a sense, gauge what is rising in terms of the collective shadow through the signs not only of what's going on the outside, but also what is animating oneself in relationship to that.
Yeah, it is one of the clearest ways to see collective shadows is to look at popular figures, pop culture, politics, that, social media influencers, that sort of stuff. Because that person is obviously an individual in their own right, but when somebody is a part of pop culture, what they represent the shadows of many. So if we're talking about no matter, who it is, whatever spiritual leader or politician, they, again, not only represent themselves, but there is a reason why they have become popularized, and it is because of the, unhealed stuff, the projected energies, the unaccepted energies of so many individuals. And so we can see how these popular movements start to begin, and there's sort of back and forth with them. For example, a big one that people are talking about right now is like, everybody's a narcissist, sort of thing. And we can see that play out. We can also see that collectively what is happening is that we have this hatred of narcissism, and then we also have this celebration of narcissism on social media, on, reality TV, where we're really rewarding people for essentially being, narcissistic in some sort of way. What happens when you are able to engage with the skills of shadow work with that or anything else, for example, is that you start to gain perspective where you're not so enmeshed or immersed with it anymore. And you can really look at it and say, what is that saying about our culture? What is that saying about the wounds of our culture or the world because of this concept or this person that is coming up right now? That's important to do in terms of really deep work on the self, because first of all, when collective energies like that come forward, what can happen is that there is energy and momentum to heal them also within the self. We talked about the mirror of reality. And so that energy is not only coming forward in the world, it's also coming forward within yourself. And so the other thing to look at in terms of this is like personal reaction. If we are personally reactive to one celebrity or one politician or one movement coming up, we can look at that and look to see, what needs to be resolved in ourselves on an individual level as well.
When you survey the scene of celebrity culture, for example, what shadows do you identify as moving? As soon as you say celebrity culture, right now I think of Taylor Swift, because in terms of news coverage, I saw a headline. I didn't investigate it, I'm afraid, but I saw a headline that was comparing the news coverage of Taylor Swift and her tour, her Eras tour, to other news items, and showing that Taylor Swift was, very, very well covered. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
So,
I've noticed. Yeah.
So what's that about?
In terms of Taylor Swift, I really think that she's, like I have a nephew who's 10 who like loves her, she's like all he wants to listen to on my Spotify. It's really screwing my Spotify dynamic. But but if we consider her to be a voice of a specific group of people. And what that means is that we can again have that perspective. And there always have been, Taylor Swifts in our culture. They might not have been such a huge phenomena, but we are living through an era in which younger women in particular, they don't have the social outlets that they once did. And so concerts and those sorts of things really provide a place where they are, again, see themselves reflected in Taylor Swift and the angst and the boyfriend stuff and, all that sort of stuff reflected back to them, where they feel they're really able to mirror, to see that part of themselves in her. And they're also able to experience this communal gathering where there are less places for communal gathering these days. We are more and more online, so it really can be a huge celebration and a huge chance to feel a sense of belonging with others that are like themselves. So what that says to me is, that we, again, on a really primal level, seek to belong, and they're finding that belonging in, $700 concert tickets, and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
So in that sense, shadow needn't necessarily be a bad thing. It could be an unmet need or an unvoiced perspective.
Yeah, I talk about shadows of light in the book. And so people are so fixated on, oh, shadows are, the stuff about yourself you don't like. But a lot of our shadows are the projections that we put onto celebrities and, popular figures, social media folks, are of the parts of ourselves that we might define as light that we deny in ourselves. For example, as children, we may have been told that we were too much, too enthusiastic, We may feel, we may project out our beauty, our genius, our musical ability, our cooking ability, I watch, some cooking shows, and, that's, definitely my projected, like, laziness, or, not that being not that great at cooking being projected outwards. But along with the difficult parts of ourselves, or the parts of ourselves that we consider bad or wrong, we also have these shadows of light, which are our power, our ingenuity, all of these aspects of ourselves that we tend to then project onto popularized figures as well.
You mentioned before dark feminine rising. I'm curious to hear a bit more about that.
Sure. Just like we have personally different things that are healed, or different sort of eras in our life, the world and the universe can also go through moods and initiations and periods of healing as well. And right now, and for like the past 5, maybe 10 years, we have been going through a period of the dark feminine, where darker energies are presenting themselves in order for us to heal and see them on an individual level, but also for the world and even the universe to heal and acknowledge them and sort of restructure itself on a larger level.
Why dark and why feminine?
It has to do with polarities. So the dark feminine has to do with the body. It has to do with creativity. It has to do with, if you look at the animus, anima, Jung always defined the anima as, if you were to look at it, of, kind of being that watery nature, where it really has to do with spirituality as a whole. And so we are going through this period of time where all of the sort of bottom of the ocean stuff is sort of coming up, in order, racism, sexism, like all this sort of stuff that we can name is coming up. And in periods of darkness, St. John of the Cross talked about this in Dark Night of the Soul. People talk about it as like a period of hopelessness and despair and depression, but really what he discovered was that in our periods of darkness is where we can experience the most reorganization, the most moving through conceptualizations of self. The best way I can describe it is sort of like turning all the lights of a house on to sort of redo the wiring a bit. And so in terms of polarities, we're going through a period of dark feminine right now, where there is a lot of fear and rage coming up, but there is also, which is part of the dark feminine, part of the first chakra. But there is also a period that we're going through of massive reorganization, sort of rewiring as well.
What do you think will be the outcome of this reorganization or rewiring? Will it lead to a new type of organization or a new configuration of wiring, metaphorically speaking? And if so, what might that look like?
I mean, I certainly would hope so. Like, that is always the hope of the outcome. It's a question whether personally and collectively, when these things come up within ourselves to heal, whether we are going to look at them or whether we're going to look away from them, basically. And so it's a question of if we do that individually and collectively or not. At the very least, what's happening right now is, a breakdown of gender, sexual identity, in a positive way for, we can always look at, kids today, like people in their that are teenagers and stuff like that, and how they're willing to explore as a way of understanding like what's coming up sort of in the next generations. The difficulty with that is that one of the ways that we can conceptualize reality is sort of like a pendulum swinging. And so whenever, or that ego defense that we were talking about, what happens when we experience growth and change or disillusion of some conceptualization of self on a collective level, just like on an individual level. There's always going to be that flat, that pendulum swinging backwards and people trying to, stick to old ways, so to speak, to not change, to repress and regress even more. So it's really a question of how far that pendulum swings and when it finally gets to a resting point where we are as a society and a culture.
As you look ahead at the next period in the news, of course, there's lots of doom and gloom. Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I think that when people get immersed in that type of thinking, it is difficult for us to have an expansive view past our lifetime. On a personal level, do I think that we're going through an environmental, apocalypse? And do I think that we're going through a period of time in which, kids that are growing up today are having tremendous difficulty and financially and in terms of just kind of basic living? Do I think that there's a lot of hatred and animosity in the world? Yes, but something to keep in mind is that, society and environment and culture moves in longer periods of time than the human lifetime. And so do I think that life environmentally, is going to be different for, children's children and stuff like that? Of course I do. Do I think that, going for the glass half full perspective, do I think that we're headed for, kind of more time indoors and, climate change and all that sort of stuff where we're kind of in that wall-y sort of world? Yeah, I do think that that is definitely a possibility. But if we're able to keep in mind that things change over an expanded period of time, the zombie apocalypse isn't going to start tomorrow. That can have perspective in terms of things. And one of the things that we can really understand about human culture, and this is proven true through wars and through all times of crisis, is that those same energies that create crisis also create ingenuity. And so in terms of the hopeful aspects of things, I do think that coming crises will inspire people to come up with solutions, to come up with ways of being, ways of living that yes, life will be a bit different, but we tend to be sort of I'll be kind. We tend to be what do I want to say? Human beings are quite resilient. I will say that.
Very interesting indeed. Well, Mary Shutan, this has been a very nice conversation indeed, very interesting. And I'd like to congratulate you on the publication of your new book, Shadow Work for the Soul. Are there any concluding remarks or anything left unsaid that you'd like to say? It needn't necessarily be, before we bring this to an end.
No, I don't think so. People can always look on my website, maryshutan.com, for teaching. I'm on social media and occasionally do a blog as well, so people can check those things out as well.
Mary Shutan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.